My daughter, Annie, was 11 years old when she lost the right to abortion. We live in the United States. She was 11 when the US Supreme Court decided the Dobbs case, which said, oh no, there isn't actually a constitutional right to abortion. They overturned the famous Roe v. Wade case. Annie is young. She thinks it's gross when two people kiss on a TV show. She turns her head away. But she's not too young to get pregnant. She's not too young to need an abortion. I was able to say to her, if you ever need an abortion, I will make sure that you get one. If you ever want an abortion. I heard a rumor that the kids were having sex in the bathrooms at Annie's school. So I asked her about it. And now the funniest joke to her is about all the sex that the kids are having in the bathrooms. She doesn't know anybody who's having sex. She says her friends don't even kiss. But one day, as they get older, these kids are going to start having sex. They need a right to abortion. Why do girls and women and anyone who can get pregnant need a right to abortion? That is our topic for today. My pregnancy with Annie was my first, and I learned a lot of what I know about pregnancy during that time. I remember the diagrams of what a woman's internal organs normally look like, and then what they look like late in pregnancy, all squished out of the way for her uterus to take up the space they usually occupy. I remember that while I was pregnant, I started to feel like this is what my body was meant to do. Now, I wasn't having some kind of mid-30s awakening into a conservative patriarchal ideology. It wasn't that. But it really seemed like this is what my body had been geared towards all the time. Of course, just because our bodies were meant to do something doesn't mean that they should do it. But over the years, how many times had my uterus prepared itself, gotten everything in place, only for no one to appear every month for many years? When I told my mother-in-law that I was pregnant with her grandchild, I said, we were visiting them in Texas, and I said, I'm pregnant. Immediately followed by, I need to go to the emergency room. I felt terrible to worry her, but pregnancies are perilous situations, and I was in a lot of pain. I had to go to the emergency room. Pregnancy is an intense experience. It can mess with your sense of what your body is. It can mess with your sense of who you are. Pregnancy is dangerous. It's dangerous to women's health. It can be dangerous to women's lives. I hope you've all noticed that some people have entered, and we're going to make sure that they get to see handouts. It's okay if someone shares a handout with them. They don't necessarily have to have their own. Because pregnancy is an intense experience and a dangerous thing to go through, no one should be forced to be pregnant. Someone should only go through this if they have chosen it. It certainly mattered a lot to me that everything I was going through was something that I had chosen. This is reason enough that we need a right to abortion. If we ask, why do women and girls and anyone who can get pregnant need a right to abortion? These facts about pregnancy provide adequate explanation. No one should be forced to be pregnant. That is why girls and women and anyone who can get pregnant need a right to abortion. Now you might say, well, what about the fetus? You know, abortion kills the fetus. Abortion deprives the fetus of life as a person. That's a very serious loss for the fetus. What about that? Doesn't that come into it? So I want to say two things about this. First, Judith Thomson compellingly argued in her famous paper, A Defense of Abortion, that even if we grant that fetuses have the full moral status of persons, nevertheless, abortion is morally permissible. Thomson said, we have to understand what pregnancy is. Pregnancy is one person providing life-sustaining aid to another being. Yes, abortion is the killing of a fetus, Thomson acknowledges, but it's a killing in order to stop providing life-sustaining aid, a killing in ceasing to provide life-sustaining aid. I think Thomson's argument is successful. But we don't really need to appeal to Thomson's argument when we're thinking about the vast majority of abortions which happen in the first trimester of pregnancy. We should not grant that fetuses in the first trimester of pregnancy have the full moral status of persons. Ultimately, I think we should not grant that they have any moral status at all. In lecture 2, I'm going to present a view that holds that the fetuses that die in early abortions don't have any moral status at all. For today, I just want us to assume that early abortion, first trimester abortion, is morally permissible and that there's no significant moral reason against early abortion. So that's just going to be an assumption of our conversation today. Well, you might say, oh, well, then we're done. Now we know abortion's just fine, that's why we need a right to abortion. But that's not true. Having established that abortion is morally permissible, or having stipulated that it's morally permissible, doesn't tell us whether a right to abortion is important, what's at stake in that right. So that's our topic for today. Why is it important to have a right to abortion? What is at stake in that right? Now, as I've already said, the fact that no one should be forced to be pregnant gives us sufficient reason that we need that right. Is the whole explanation of why we need a right to abortion that no one should be forced to be pregnant? No. It's also true that no one should be forced into motherhood, and that outlawing abortion forces many girls and women who would otherwise want abortions, forces them into motherhood. This is a fact about abortion rights that is well understood. So political advocacy in favor of abortion rights is very explicit that this is a feminist issue. What's at stake is women getting to author our own lives to determine when we become mothers to new children. The Roe versus Wade decision in the United States that established the constitutional right to abortion was very explicit that part of why we need the right to abortion is so that we can control when we become mothers. In the United States, the large organization of health clinics called Planned Parenthood is called that for a reason, because parenthood should be planned and chosen and not forced upon people. But some have disputed that outlawing abortion forces anyone into motherhood, and I want to talk about that now. When the US Supreme Court was considering the Dobbs case, and this is the case in which they ultimately took away the right to abortion, there's a phase of consideration called oral argument, when lawyers come before the Supreme Court justices and make arguments, and the justices ask them questions, and sometimes the thinking of the Supreme Court justices is revealed during these conversations. And at that time, the newest Supreme Court Justice was Amy Coney Barrett. And she said, is it really true that outlawing abortion forces anyone into motherhood? After all, in the United States, we have these safe haven laws. These are laws that allow someone who gives birth to surrender their baby and have no legal rights or responsibilities regarding that baby. So, yes, outlawing abortion forces people to be pregnant, but it doesn't force anyone into motherhood, into raising a baby, because they can just take advantage of a safe haven law and give the baby away. Before I talk about what's wrong with Barrett's idea, I want to talk a little bit about how she comes to have her idea. So let's psychologize her a little. Barrett is a Catholic. She believes that full moral personhood is present in every human being from the moment of conception. So how does she see women and girls who want to abort their fetuses? She sees them as women who want to kill their own child. If that's what you think is going on, you think, well, here's someone who wants to kill her own child, well, then you will think, well, several months later, when the child is born, of course, it would be no problem to give the child away. That's my psychologizing of Barrett. This, of course, involves a real failure to understand the psychology of many girls and women who are pregnant and want abortions. And there are two important ways that this misunderstands their psychology. First of all, many girls and women who are pregnant do not think that their fetuses matter morally or members of the moral community have moral status, but recognize full well that if they're forced to turn their fetuses into babies, those babies will matter very much. Second of all, and relatedly but distinctly, typically a girl or woman who wants to abort, who wants to kill her fetus, does not love her fetus. But she might well understand about herself that if forced to turn her fetus into a baby, if forced to gestate and nurture that fetus across months, sharing her body with that fetus, by the time the baby is born, she will love that baby. She will see this as her child. And the thought of taking advantage of a safe haven law or making an adoption plan for the baby will be intolerable to her. It's this anticipated love that is common among girls and women who seek abortions. It's this anticipated love that I think explains how outlawing abortion forces girls and women into motherhood. And it's that anticipated love that I want us to talk about today. So this is my first of 3 lectures on love and abortion. And the love that we're interested in today is anticipated love for a fetus one does not love now. Many who desperately prefer to get an abortion now also strongly prefer that if forced to gestate their fetuses, if forced to turn their fetuses into babies, they desperately prefer to raise those babies themselves rather than give them away. Indeed, studies have shown that women who seek abortions but are unable to obtain abortions overwhelmingly then raise the child. They do not, the majority do not make adoption plans for those children. And this makes sense because this is good evidence that this is a common psychological phenomenon among girls and women. Outlawing abortion forces women and girls into motherhood because it forces them into a situation in which they turn a fetus they don't love into a baby they do love and a baby they can't bear not to raise. Now, someone might object that it can't be true that someone is forced into doing something if they have an alternative in which they don't do it. They weren't forced, they made a choice, they had an option. And I just want to talk about that for a minute. I think that's not true. So the question is, can it be true that someone is forced to do something even if they have an alternative in which they don't do it? I think it can be true that they're forced. And I'm going to use a case to illustrate that this can happen. And I just want to be clear that this is a very low-stakes case. I'm just using it, it's a lower-stakes case compared to the case of abortion. And I'm just using it to illustrate that you can be forced into doing something even if you have an alternative. Okay, so in the United States, we have a holiday that is very important to us, Thanksgiving, in the end of November. And it's traditional that you spend Thanksgiving with your family, you have a big meal, and typically you don't work on Thanksgiving. Another tradition that's very important to us is shopping. And on the Friday after Thanksgiving, we have lots of sales, and it's called Black Friday, and people buy a lot for Christmas, which is about a month away, and even people who don't celebrate Christmas often really like to go shopping on Black Friday. And over time, the stores that would host the sales started starting the sales earlier and earlier, like 4 a.m. Friday, midnight Friday morning, and then it started, and then sometimes the sales would start on Thursday, so they would start on Thanksgiving, which meant that employees were required to work on Thanksgiving. This went on for a while. And so these employees weren't able to spend Thanksgiving with their families. But then some of the big chain companies in the United States, like Target, they had a change of heart, and they issued these announcements. We will not be open on Thanksgiving anymore. We don't want to force our employees to work on Thanksgiving. That's the kind of language they used. So they said that they'd been forcing their employees to work on Thanksgiving, and I think that's right, they had been forcing them. So what were they doing? Were they locking the doors of the store and not letting the employees leave? No. Were they holding the employees at gunpoint? No. They were just saying to them, you have to work, we've put you on the schedule, otherwise you'll lose your job. And what was true of many employees is that they had a pattern of preferences. Their first choice was to not work on Thanksgiving, to spend Thanksgiving with their families and keep their jobs. But if forced to work on Thanksgiving, they much preferred, if put in a situation where whether they worked on Thanksgiving was whether they kept their job, they much preferred to work on Thanksgiving and keep their job than stay home and spend time with their families and lose their jobs. But they had a choice. They could have just stayed home, and they just would have lost their jobs. But clearly, this is a case where they were forced to work on Thanksgiving. So the announcements from the companies when they came up with their new policies to not be open on Thanksgiving, they were speaking accurately when they said they'd been forcing their employees to work. And so this shows that, yes, you can be forced to do something even though there's an alternative in which you don't do it. I think this also shows something else, too. Perhaps some of the workers, faced with an assignment to work on Thanksgiving, said, no, I'm going to go be with my family, and they went off to be with their family and lost their jobs. That phenomenon, that happened, doesn't undermine the claim that for the others who worked, they were forced to work on Thanksgiving. Similarly, the fact that some girls and women who seek abortions are forced to continue their pregnancies and then take advantage of safe haven laws or making adoption plans, the fact that some girls and women are not forced into motherhood by the outlawing of abortion does not mean that other girls and women aren't also who do end up mothers, have not been forced. They still have been. Okay, let's look at page 2. Why do we need a right to abortion? Well, because no one should be forced to be pregnant. Pregnancy is intense and dangerous. Because no one should be forced into motherhood. Why does lack of access to abortion force girls and women into motherhood? Because of a common pattern of preferences, because many girls and women who seek abortions desperately prefer to abort. That's their first choice. But if forced to continue their pregnancies, they prefer to raise the babies that they've been forced to turn their fetuses into rather than making an adoption plan. Why do they have those preferences? Because of the love that they anticipate they would have for the baby that their fetus would develop into. Thus, why do we need a right to abortion? Crucially, partly because of love. Baby Stephen was born 3 months premature. As soon as he was born, he went into the NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit, and he was there for months. We brought groceries to his parents, and we sent a lot of love, and we said, when he's home, we'll have a baby shower, because he'd been born before any baby shower. He got an infection, and he got worse, and then he got better, and it went back and forth. And then he died. At his funeral, the coffin was tiny. His mother, my friend, sang a song to her dead baby, and I thought I would never recover from how sad I felt at that moment. 15 years later, my nephew Finnegan was born, also premature, but only 6 weeks premature. He was in the NICU for a month and a half, and then he got to go home. He's 2 years old now, and totally healthy and exhausting in the best way. For anyone like me who has loved a NICU baby, or in my case, 2 NICU babies, we know that medical advances that help premature babies to be nurtured up into healthy full-term babies are very valuable. We are grateful for what they can already do, as they did for Finnegan, and we look forward to advancements in this technology for other babies. Should we welcome the development of artificial gestation? Yes, it's going to help premature babies. That's huge. But what I want to talk about now is a way that the development of artificial gestation is also worrying, in that it poses a threat to abortion rights. And it turns out to really matter how we understand abortion rights. What does the right to abortion come to? 2 things happen in an abortion nowadays. A pregnancy is ended. A fetus is exited from the woman's body. That's the first thing. And a fetus is killed. So just to be clear, I'm going to use the word abortion to mean both of those things happen. So the killing of the fetus and the ending of the pregnancy. But what gives us a right to have an abortion? If the right to abortion is merely grounded in the right not to be pregnant, then it's just the right to exit the fetus from your body. Suppose that artificial gestation technology advances. Suppose that we get to the point that a premature baby born 6 months early can be turned through artificial gestation into a healthy full-term baby. Or a premature baby born 7 months early. A premature baby born 7 months early is born just 2 months after conception, well within the first trimester. Suppose we get to the point that at any stage of pregnancy, we can take the fetus out of the pregnant woman's body and artificially gestate it, nurture it up into a healthy, full-term baby. What will happen to abortion rates then? Well, of course, some people will say that the right to abortion was only ever about the right not to be pregnant, and that it's only really a right to exit the fetus from your body. So what will that be like for women and girls who find themselves pregnant and wanting to abort? And again, by wanting to abort, I mean wanting to end the pregnancy and kill the fetus. They will find that killing the fetus is not available to them. And what they get to do is either continue their pregnancies or have the fetus exited from their body so that it will be artificially gestated and turned into a healthy baby. Now, many girls and women contemplating a scenario in which the fetus is exited from their body and turns into a healthy full-term baby will say, but that's my baby. If this fetus is going to get turned into a baby, that's my baby. I want to raise that baby. I don't want someone else to raise my baby. Not everyone will think that, but I think the majority of girls and women would feel that, much as nowadays the majority of girls and women who are unable to obtain abortions raise the babies. So what that means is that if girls and women merely have the right to exit the fetus from their bodies, many will be forced into motherhood. But more than that is true because, and again, what explains why they'll be forced is this anticipated love for the baby that their fetus would be turned into. But it's not just that they will be forced into motherhood in this scenario, because these same girls and women thinking this through might well think, the scenario in which the fetus is exited from my body and then turned into a baby and then I raise it involves this weird alienation of me from my own child for this period of time, the gestation time, and given I'm going to raise this baby, I want to gestate the baby. So what will in fact happen is that, given what I think would be a common pattern of preferences, girls and women would actually be forced in this scenario into both pregnancy and motherhood. And here again, because of love, because of the anticipated love for the baby that their child would be turned into. So they would be forced into pregnancy not by being told, we refuse to exit the fetus from your body, that would be available to them, but they would be forced into pregnancy by the fact that it is a scenario in which the alternatives will be too abhorrent to them. So in this scenario, the scenario in which artificial gestation has remarkably advanced, what would ground a right to abortion, which is a right to both kill the fetus and end the pregnancy, not just a right to exit the fetus from our bodies? What would ground a right to abortion is that otherwise girls and women will be forced into both pregnancy and motherhood. And what explains why outlawing abortion would force them? Love, the anticipated love that they would have for the baby that their fetus would be turned into. Now, when we talk about what grounds a right to abortion in the case in which artificial gestation has greatly improved, it's going to be also important that fetuses that die in early abortions don't have moral status, which is, again, an assumption of the conversation today. What this means is that once artificial gestation has sufficiently advanced, love will be the reason we need a right to abortion. And now page 3. My friend Miguel was raised in a Catholic country, and he told me that when he was a young man, he was terrified of having sex with the young women he dated because they were Catholic, and they refused to use birth control, and they also would never get an abortion. And so while he, in some sense, very much wanted to have sex with them, he was really afraid of ending up a father at a time that he didn't want to be a father. Now, someone might object to what I've said so far and say, look, men and boys don't have a right not to be forced into fatherhood. So why should women and girls have a right to be forced into motherhood? Now, how is it that men and boys might get forced into fatherhood? Well, many men and boys may have the same pattern of preferences that I've been describing. So there might be a pregnancy for which the father of the fetus would very much prefer that there be an abortion and that the fetus be killed. And yet he may also have the strong preference that if the fetus is turned into a baby, he would think, well, that's my baby, and he would want to play an active role in raising the baby. So he might have that same pattern of preferences that would lead the continuation of a pregnancy that he would prefer were ended to force him into fatherhood. Now, I think we have to recognize that it's a bad thing when men and boys are forced into fatherhood. So I don't want to develop a view on which it's really serious that women and girls not be forced into motherhood, but it's no big deal that men and boys be forced into fatherhood. That's not right at all. I think it is worth noting that sociologically, women and girls have a harder time walking away from their own genetic children than men and boys do. So there's a sense in which women and girls are at greater risk of being forced into motherhood than men and boys are of being forced into fatherhood. But nevertheless, there are many men and boys who will have this pattern of preferences and who will find fatherhood forced upon them by the continuation of a pregnancy that they would prefer to have ended. What we have here is an additional strong reason that's in favor of a right to abortion for girls and women and for anyone who can get pregnant. Because often enough, when there's a surprise pregnancy, both the father of the fetus and the mother of the fetus would prefer that the pregnancy end and that the fetus be killed. And so abortion rights end up sparing many boys and men from being forced into fatherhood. Now, is it sufficiently weighty and bad that men and boys be forced into fatherhood that they should be able to require women to get abortions so that they're not forced into fatherhood? Absolutely not. Whether abortion is a surgical procedure or is merely a medication abortion, it is still a serious medical event, a medical invasion of the pregnant woman's body, and it must be chosen by her. It should not be imposed by anyone. It's important that we not say, oh, we shouldn't impose abortion on a pregnant person because of its dangers. Abortion is extremely safe and much safer than pregnancy. So we can't use that reason, but it's still a medical treatment, an invasion that should not be opposed. I do think, though, that because it's a very serious thing to be forced into fatherhood, women and girls who are pregnant and who are considering continuing their pregnancies, I think they have a strong moral reason, indeed a duty, to consult the fathers of their fetuses about their preferences. Their preferences matter. They should take seriously, if they want to continue their pregnancies, that they might be forcing fatherhood upon someone who would prefer not to become a father right now. As a caveat, sometimes a pregnant woman or girl knows that it would not be safe to talk to the father of the fetus about her pregnancy, and then, of course, there's no duty to talk to him. There is an interesting asymmetry here. While a pregnant woman should consult the father of the fetus before continuing her pregnancy, I think there is no similar reason to consult the father of the fetus before aborting. So suppose that a girl or woman is pregnant and wants to abort, and the father of the fetus prefers that she continues the pregnancy. This happens often enough. I think morally speaking, what he's really asking of her is that she create a child for him. And we just don't have any moral duties to take seriously other people's desires that we create children for them. And so, while I think you should not continue a pregnancy without considering the ramifications for the father of the fetus, it is just fine to abort without considering the preferences of the father of the fetus. The weighty thing that you do is continue the pregnancy, not abort it. Someone might object to what I've said so far as follows. Is love really the reason that people prefer to raise the babies they've created? What about shame and societal pressure? So the objector says, look, there could be someone who's forced to continue her pregnancy, and she would really like to take advantage of a safe haven law or make a plan, an adoption plan, but everybody saw that she was pregnant. It's not hard to hide a pregnancy. And everybody would say to her, like, where's your baby? What are you doing? Why aren't you raising your baby? And that would be very hard to take. And people would be very critical of her, and she might feel bad about herself too. And for that reason, she might well raise the baby. And I agree that for some people, that will be the explanation of how they come to raise their babies if they're unable to abort. So in some cases, it's shame and societal pressure that explains how outlawing abortion forces those people into motherhood. But I think for many girls and women, it just doesn't come up for them because the idea of giving up the baby is so awful to them that they don't get to the point of thinking about the downsides of doing so because their love for the baby is powerful. So I think this is only an explanation in some cases. So how do we understand my claim that love explains how outlawing abortion forces girls and women into motherhood? We have to understand my claim as that love plays a major explanatory role. It explains it in most cases, but may not provide the whole explanation of how outlawing abortion forces girls and women into motherhood. Finally, I want to say something about abortion rights and abortion access. I've talked about both today. What is it that we need? Well, a right to abortion isn't enough because what forces girls and women into motherhood is just not getting the abortion. So if you have a technical legal right to abortion but no access to abortion, you're still going to be forced into motherhood. And for that matter, into pregnancy. But access to abortion is also not enough because you need some security to that access. You need some confidence that it will be there for you if and when you need it. Because women have to know that they can be the authors of their own lives. And so we need not just access, but a right that will endure. In conclusion, why do we need abortion? Because no one should be forced to be pregnant, and because of love. If forced to continue our pregnancies, we anticipate that we will love the babies we are forced to turn our fetuses into, and we will thereby be forced into motherhood. And because of love, some will be forced into fatherhood. I've also argued that if artificial gestation technology advances, then the reason we need a right to abortion will be love. Thanks.
I just wanted to ask a question. I agree with you that there is this asymmetry between the biological mother and the biological father. But I think when you say there's no reason at all to consult with the man, I just wanted to question that. I mean, I'm willing to agree that this reason needn't amount to a duty or anything of that sort, but just taking my cue from your empirical claims about what people are likely to do when they can anticipate that they will love or whatever. So it's depending on what their beliefs and emotions and attitudes and so on are. Suppose the father is, or the biological father is a strict Catholic again, who believes that the fetus is a person with full moral status and an immortal soul and all the rest of it. And suppose that without being able to see this fetus or anything, the father feels something that he thinks of at least as love for this fetus and desperately doesn't want this person who's his child, whom he loves, and so on, to be killed. So really, that's just the question. I'm happy to be recorded and whatever.
We'll be requiring your signature. Okay, so Jeff's question is, I said that if a pregnant woman wants to abort, she has no reason to consult the father of the fetus before aborting. And Jeff says, well, isn't that incorrect? Because we can imagine that the father of the fetus is Catholic and thinks it would be like a terrible thing for her to abort the pregnancy, to kill what he thinks is a full-blown person there, his child in her womb. Doesn't that give her a reason to consult him? So what I want to say is the actual moral situation, apart from some mistaken moral views that people might have, doesn't give her a reason. But, in general, so one thought is, well, in general, if you're going to do something to someone that they think would be a great wrong to them, you should talk to them about it first. And there, I think it might depend on your relationship with them. So, if this is someone who she hopes to be on good terms with in the future, yeah, that might be a reason to talk to him. But, I think he's got a false view of what's going on. And it's not in general true that the mere fact that people have false views that we're doing something bad to them or bad, morally bad in general, I don't think that we always then have to sort of take their views seriously in that way. I do think it matters whether they're in a relationship. So in a way, my claim, the Stark claim is most clearly true if they're not in a relationship, my claim. And if they are in a relationship, yeah, you might have relationship-based reasons to talk to him because he's going to have opinions and he's going to care what you did. But my claim is that you're just not doing anything wrong to him in aborting. And thus, you don't need to weigh his attitude. Thanks, Jeff. Oh, the microphone.
Oh, no, it's fine. I need the exercise.
Hi. Something I was just wondering about is whether, as you're thinking about it, love in particular is doing a lot of work here, or if it's equivalent to something like strong preference that could be driven by another reason. So, what I was wondering is whether someone who, for example, was raised as a strict Catholic and just sort of doesn't see abortion as an option, even if it's available to them, is also forced into motherhood in a situation where they have an unwanted pregnancy, kind of regardless of whether they love the fetus at the early stage.
Okay, thanks. So the question is, could things other than love do the same kind of explanatory work that I'm saying the anticipated love for the baby does? And one kind of case to think about is one in which the pregnant woman is Catholic and for that reason isn't going to abort. What we really want is an explanation of why, if continuing the pregnancy, she'll then raise the baby. I don't know that Catholicism gives us that, right? So, it could, but it needn't. So I think that Catholicism wouldn't explain, in particular, in particular why she would end up raising the baby, except for Catholicism would explain why she continues the pregnancy, and then the phenomenon that I'm talking about. So Catholicism combined with anticipated love of the baby that her fetus will become, that could explain how mere pregnancy forces her into motherhood, because she doesn't see abortion as a viable option. Thanks.
Hello. Hi. Thank you for the talk. I was just wondering, this idea of artificial gestation. I wanted to sort of circumvent it and go into what's happening in developing countries, where you have this very robust industry of surrogacy.
Yeah.
So basically, if anyone is unaware, often people or often women who are destitute or very poor, they tend to rent out their wombs to well-off couples. So let's say, so this is a very hypothetical question. So if, let's say, there is a woman who decides to who accepts the baby, and she's getting all her nutrition and everything from the clinic. She's not doing anything on her own. And her relationship with the baby is purely contractual. It's all for the money. And suddenly she becomes very rich because she wins the lottery. Then what happens? Does she have the right to abortion? Because it's not her baby per se, it's the couple's baby. And if I can just go to another question, if that's okay.
No, why don't I answer this one, and then we could let you
Sure.
ask another one.
Yeah.
Okay, so the question is, how does all of this look if we think about surrogacy? And, in a surrogate pregnancy, let's consider a surrogate pregnancy where the surrogate is not at all genetically related to the baby that she's carrying, which is sort of now considered best practices for surrogacy after some messy cases in the past. Suppose that a woman agrees to be a surrogate for financial reasons, but then wins the lottery and doesn't want to be a surrogate anymore, has no need of the money. Does she have a right to abortion, you're asking? Now, I think this is a very interesting case that you've raised. And I think what I want to say about it is, please come back for lecture 3, in which we will talk about surrogacy and how these things play out when it comes to surrogacy. We're going to talk about that a lot in lecture 3. So thank you for helping me to advertise lecture 3.
Yeah, if it's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. It's relatively similar, but essentially with artificial gestation, suppose we have this technology which basically says, even if you're 1 day pregnant, you can have access to this technology. So I feel like the sort of anticipated love that develops when you're carrying your own baby for 9 months will be very different from when you have like a technology developing the baby. So how is motherhood changing in these respects with the development of gestation technology? And because to me it just seems like with artificial gestation, if you have money, you can sort of have the baby, and it's like, yeah, it's very it becomes an investment rather than like a product of your love, I'd say.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so I think you're raising at least 2 interesting questions. So one question is, how should we think about a woman's attitude to her fetus as it becomes a baby in the case of like ordinary gestation where she's carrying the baby versus this kind of fantastical artificial gestation case that I offered where it could happen even from very early in pregnancy, or surrogacy where someone else is carrying a baby that you're intending to raise. And in particular, when I first said that if forced to continue our pregnancies, we're going to end up loving our babies, I talked about what pregnancy is like, how you're nurturing the baby and you're taking care of the baby and you are sharing your body with the baby. So what I think about this is that, in fact, actual pregnancy, there's a lot that happens that plays a role in developing the love that a woman anticipates having for the baby at the end. But I also think that even when a woman or girl considers the artificial gestation case, she may well think about herself, I'm going to love that baby. So I think that even though pregnancy in fact plays a role when it's happening, that you can have this without the pregnancy, that the fact that it's your kid genetically and, you know, the in fact causal history, I think that the love can be there that way. And, you know, and also the fact that fathers have these, you know, I think this is a common pattern of preference among fathers of fetuses who actually would prefer that abortion happen, but they also know that if the fetus is turned into a baby, they want to play an active role in that baby's life. You know, men don't get to gestate, but they still have this pattern of preferences. The other thing that you raised was about the role of money. And, you know, that may or may not come up in lecture 3, but why don't you come up and raise that again then, too? Thanks.
Thanks so much for a wonderful first talk. I wanted to go back to the beginning of your talk when you're talking about why certain things can't be forced upon a person. And I presume that the reason we're talking about that is because maybe it's permissible to force certain things on people. We have lots of obligations that we impose on people. And you talked about, right at the start when you were talking about no one should be forced to be pregnant, you mentioned that, well, pregnancy is dangerous, no one should be forced to do anything dangerous. And the other reason is that pregnancy is a really intense experience and no one should be forced to undergo an intense experience. And I was wondering if you could say a bit more about what grounds that prohibition, forcing someone into an intense experience that they may or may not want. I'm just curious about that because I understand why, what would ground an obligation or prohibition against forcing into something that's dangerous for someone, it might harm their well-being. But could you say a bit more about why we can't force people into intense experiences?
Thank you. So when I was explaining why no one should be forced to be, so the question is, when I was explaining why no one should be forced to be pregnant, I said it's an intense experience and it's a dangerous experience. And the question is, well, yeah, it's clear why we don't want to force dangerous, health-risking things on people, but why does it matter about intense things? Great. And I guess I want to say, I don't know what general principles I want to be committed to. So maybe it's important that it's both intense and dangerous. I'm not sure. But I think in a way, the thing that I wanted to emphasize is that it's a really big deal. It's just a really big experience. And hard to go through, like psychologically difficult, psychologically dramatic, and just we shouldn't mess with other people's lives in that way, I guess. But I'm going to think more about whether there's more that I can say.
Thank you. I was very interested in this asymmetry you highlighted between the father and the mother,
Yeah.
and how their opinions and eventually maybe their love matters more or less. So in that context, I was wondering if you would consider the inverse situation where a father might want the abortion and a mother might want to keep the child. Does the anticipated love of the father then give him the same right to, let's say, demand the abortion? Or how would you consider that situation?
Okay, great. So the question is, what if, sorry, did you say the case where the woman wants to continue the pregnancy and the man wants her to abort? Okay, so the question is, I said that if the woman wants to abort and the man wants her to continue the pregnancy, she doesn't have to take that seriously. But I also said that if a woman wants to continue the pregnancy and the man wants her to abort, she should take that seriously. Like she should find out his preference. And she should take that seriously, because if she's continuing the pregnancy, then she's forcing him into fatherhood. But I didn't really say what should happen next. So I said she should find out his preference and take it seriously. But how does that help her? Like, what should she do then? She wants to continue the pregnancy. He wants her to abort. How does she decide is a question that we might ask. And I don't think I have that much help to give. I just think she should recognize that this is a very weighty thing that she's doing to him. And I guess I think there isn't an interesting sense in which continuing the pregnancy should be the default. Continuing the pregnancy is like this huge dramatic thing where we create another morally significant being. Aborting the pregnancy, while it can be emotionally a big deal for the parents of the fetus, and that's importantly true, and I'm going to talk about that a lot in lecture 2. We don't alter how many morally significant beings there are in the world. Things go on much as they were. Aborting is morally much less of a big deal. In fact, ultimately, I think aborting is a big deal only because continuing a pregnancy is a big deal, because it's the failure to continue the pregnancy. So yes, I just think she should weigh it heavily, but I don't have a view about how she should then decide if she and he disagree about what should happen. Thanks.
Thanks so much,
Mia.
Liz. This is again a question about the particular work that love is doing in your argument. So if I understand you right, restricting abortion forces women to be mothers because of these widespread preference sets, right? And then in turn, these preferences are kind of grounded in or entangled with love. And then we have this further claim that seems, intuitively really plausible. No one should be forced to be a mother or a father. But it seems like there are going to be cases in which you can have weird preferences that could generate a case in which that's kind of analogous to this case where we're not going to have the intuition that you're being forced. So to take a really trivial case,
Sure.
So no one should be forced into being a recluse, right? Being a recluse is bad for you. But suppose that my preferences are like jaywalk or nothing, right? So jaywalk or I stay home. And then there's a law outlawing jaywalking, right? We probably intuitively don't want to say that I'm being forced to be a recluse. I mean, depending on where the preferences are coming from. If there's a kind of widespread psychological disorder that causes this kind of preference, maybe. But so what I'm thinking here is, well, part of what's doing the work is the kind of reasonableness of
Yes.
the preference set, right? So love
Right.
is doing this important work for you. It's not just the structure, the bare kind of structure of the preferences. It's that we think that there's something reasonable at the minimum, if not positively good, about loving your genetic offspring.
Yeah.
Okay, but now suppose like Shulamith Firestone is right, and actually having preferential feelings about your genetic offspring is just bad. It's like the kind of preference of jaywalk or nothing, right? I'm not saying you need to endorse this view. I'm just, suppose it's correct,
Yeah.
right? And suppose that it's, the reason that you see so many women expressing these kind of preferences isn't just because of the kind of mechanism of social shame, but like an intense internalization of these norms that
Yeah.
privilege biological and genetic connection, that associate that with property, that think of family as fundamentally more important than forms of non-genetic and non-familial kinship and so on,
Yeah.
right? then it seems like we no longer have this intuition, or like we would have a problem then from drawing an inference from this explanation, the correct explanation, or it might even be an explanation in terms of love, but a kind of perverted love, a love that's produced by patriarchal ideology. And then we don't get the thought that abortion restrictions force people into being mothers, right? So, yeah, I'm just interested in like you saying more about that, like how important it is to you that this is not just the correct descriptive explanation of preference structure, but actually a vindication of that preference structure. Like this is a good way for for our preferences to be organized.
Thanks. Okay, so Amia's question is, isn't a bare preference ordering inadequate to establish that anybody's been forced into anything? People could have crazy preference structures. Someone could end up a recluse because they want to jaywalk freely without any consequences, or they will stay home, but we have laws against jaywalking, so they would get in trouble if they jaywalked, and they're just unwilling to do that, so they stay home. It doesn't really seem that we've forced them to be a recluse, but their preference structure, by making jaywalking illegal in combination with their preference structure, now they're staying home. So Mia's proposed suggestion is that it matters whether the preference structure that leads to the forcing is a reasonable preference structure, and I do think that that matters. I also think, though, with the jaywalker, with the recluse, if we were making a rule just for him, we might think about this, so it matters that we're making a rule for everybody. But so we might say, well, we're not going to give him a hard time about jaywalking because that would force him to stay home. It's not crazy to say that, so I'm not sure. But I do think it matters that in my story, the anticipated love for the baby, anticipating love for a baby that you would turn your fetus into a fetus you don't love now, that's all entirely reasonable. I do think that matters. And Amia said, look, some people think that these intense feelings that we have for our own kids, it's all a result of a messed up, patriarchal, racist, colonialist, just very bad way of viewing the world, where it's us versus them, and women should take care of their children, and everything is, there are problematic gender roles. And, of course, for much of what seems normal and healthy and reasonable to us, we have to ask, is this just because of misguided, messed up stuff in our culture? And it's very hard to know for sure. What if, in fact, it is fundamentally unhealthy for women to privilege their own children? How does that change this? So, that's interesting. On the one hand, I want to say, if that's the true story, I would just want to think it through again. One thing that I'm inclined to say is we have to take people as they are to some extent, and we all deal with people who in various ways we think do have priorities that are not ideal because of how the cultures that they grew up in. And I think it's a little dangerous to say, well, that person has a messed up attitude because of her culture, so I'm just going to ignore that aspect of her when I decide how I treat her, even though, in fact, the way I treat her will be super bad for her. But she shouldn't really have that attitude, So I almost worry that suppose that story is right and it's all patriarchy, we'd almost be twice victimizing people for, the first victimization is that the patriarchy made them care too much about their own children, and the second is that then we're forcing them into motherhood because they have those preferences. So that would be one way that I would worry about it. Thanks.
Thanks, Amir. Can you pass the mic?
Hey, Joseph.
Hi, Liz. Thanks for the talk. Okay, so if so the argument depends on it being wrong to force pregnant persons into parenthood, and that makes it seem to me like it should be just as wrong to force non-pregnant persons into parenthood. So, for instance, men and boys, and without calling that a right. So I agree about the pragmatic consideration that the non-pregnant persons shouldn't be able to impose medical treatment, but that only seems to get it as far as an unenforceable duty on the part of the pregnant person to abort if the other parent doesn't want it to be continued, which seems to run counter to the standard pro-choice position. So I'm wondering if you're happy to bite that bullet, or if you think that there's something more to say.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so the question is, haven't I argued that it's wrong to outlaw abortion because it's wrong to force girls and women into motherhood, but doesn't that mean it's wrong in general to force people into parenthood? And then when we think about the pregnant woman who wants to continue her pregnancy but would be forcing the father of the fetus into active fatherhood because that's what his preferences will lead to, Joseph says, look, it may be that nobody can impose an abortion on her, but there's still the question about what's right or wrong for her to do. And it seems like I'm committed to the view that it's wrong for her to continue her pregnancy because she'd be forcing fatherhood upon the father of the fetus. Okay. Well, so what I want to say is, I didn't really say that it's wrong to force people into motherhood. But now it's going to look like the conclusion that I drew is weaker than you thought. So I started with the question, why do we need abortion? What's at stake in having a right to abortion and having access to abortion? Why is this important? And so my answers are, it's important whether we have abortion because if abortion is outlawed or unavailable, girls and women and people who can be pregnant are forced into pregnancy and are forced into motherhood. And if it's our legal system doing it, we are doing it. Our government is us acting, and we'd be forcing them into motherhood. And I do think it's wrong and that we shouldn't do it. But I also just think we shouldn't want to do it, and we shouldn't do it. But also, we don't have anything at stake that could justify our doing it. And that puts us in making abortion laws in a very different situation from the woman who's pregnant, because she has just different things at stake. So that's the real answer to your question. What she has at stake, she has reasons to continue the pregnancy. We have no similar reasons to outlaw abortion or to make it unavailable. Thanks, Joseph.
Thanks so much. I wanted to run a sort of devil's advocate argument by you, and since I'm being filmed, I guess I should outline that I don't really agree with this. But
Okay.
I did
For
want to see what you make
yeah.
of it.
Make it clear.
So I wanted to go back to the point that men and boys should not be able to impose medical treatment on women and girls. Well, if we've already made this sort of hypothetical that artificial gestation will one day be advanced enough to the point where you can just take it out any time, then surely we can also have a method of abortion that's even easier than Plan B pills. That is, completely painless, completely not a hassle, just like snap of your fingers and it's done. In that case, I guess the story we're telling, right, is that the only reason men and boys should not be able to impose medical treatment on women and girls is on account of this autonomy. And that's just a clarification point, yes?
You keep going.
Okay, so assuming that's right, then the picture I see is that it's if the mother is a Catholic and the father really wants to abort, then if the pregnancy goes through, then it's a great joy for the mother, she becomes a mother. but the father is miserable because he's been forced into being a father. And if that were the case, then surely it would be better to err on the side of caution and just have an abortion imposed, because it is such a non-hassle, because it's barely anything. And I guess the natural retort might be, well, no one should ever have any restrictions on their autonomy, but we already have all sorts of systems in place, like speed limits on highways that we sort of enter into when we get a driver's license, in the same way that you could say, well, when you have sex, you're implicitly agreeing to a contract that someone could impose an abortion on you if it is really that harmless. And I guess another natural response might be that, well, maybe this woman is a Catholic and it will cause her severe emotional distress to have an abortion imposed on her. And my response might be, well, there are certain restrictions that we impose on people that make them very distressed. I don't really see what's so bad about that. Thank you.
Okay, so the question is, since we're doing science fiction, let's consider a case where abortion is just so medically easy. You take a pill and you're not pregnant anymore and there aren't side effects and it's just almost magical, but medical, not magical. Doesn't that help to change the calculation? And if we really take seriously that in continuing a pregnancy, you may be forcing a man into fatherhood. Now, one thing I want to mention that you said sort of in passing was, look, this guy, he's going to be miserable because he's been forced into fatherhood. Interestingly, I don't think that that's right. So I think in general, people forced into motherhood, people forced into fatherhood, there might not be any misery at all. There might not be any unhappiness or bad experience involved in being forced into motherhood or forced into fatherhood. Parenthood involves many joys and sorrows, whether chosen or not, and I don't think it's necessarily so different whether chosen or not, because just the parenthood itself takes over and may well dwarf any facts about whether it was chosen, because you do love the kid, typically. I think however easy you make the abortion, it's still a bodily invasion, and I don't think we can get away from that. And so I do think it does come down to autonomy, and you can't do it, you can't impose it. But it is helpful to think of your imagined case, because it does just bring that out, the physical location of the fetus is a crucial fact in thinking about what can be done to the fetus. Thanks.
Hello, thank you for an amazing lecture. It was very important topic, and it more deeply maybe where as I've seen it now. So to continue maybe ideas from previously, and I absolutely agree with you that nobody can impose to be a motherhood or to make an abortion. But if we think that men can be forced into fatherhood, why women cannot be forced to motherhood? In the context of male consent to abortion, in the content of equal rights, right for fatherhood, right for family, and if we agree that, yes, we have asymmetry rights, and we can speak only about women, only about motherhood, not about rights for a father, as we have now in legal system, can we discuss about compensation of moral harm for a man who won't be a father, who won't continue pregnancy, but women want an abortion? And when he agreed to be a single father, etc., etc. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks. So, a couple different things that you were asking. So one thing you were asking is about the question of whether we should have consent to abortion from both the parents of the fetus. So there are legal regimes that require for example, that a husband consent to a wife's abortion. And so one question is, what do I think about that? And what I think about that is that's a regime in which people have inappropriate control over other, in which men have inappropriate control over women's autonomy, and it's really not okay. And I also think it's very hard to understand what could justify it because, my view, as we'll discuss in lecture 2, is that nothing morally bad happens in an early abortion. Although I do think it can be bad for the father of the fetus if he wanted the pregnancy to continue, but not in a way that need be taken seriously. So I think that there's no justification for male consent to abortion being required. Another thing that you brought up is the idea of compensation of moral harm. And, one thing that happens to boys and men is that sometimes there's an unexpected pregnancy, and they would prefer that an abortion occur, and then the pregnancy continues, and apart from whether they raise the child, they play an active role in raising the child, they have all these financial duties to the child. And, one thing that some people who are good at doing this, stepping back big picture, criticizing our society, kind of thinking that Mia was bringing up, people point out that, really we should just have good social services and good social safety nets that would obviate some of the need for fathers to pay child support in such cases because there would just, society would have provided already. So that's a kind of compensation for moral harm that we should have built into society anyway, because we should just have better safety nets. But I guess what I want to say is, as I said to Joseph when he asked about women wronging men by forcing them into fatherhood by continuing their pregnancies, I don't think it's right to say that the women are wronging the men because they think they just have a good reason. But I think that they should weigh that that's part of what's happening. Thanks.
Thank
you. Hi. Yeah, it's possible that you've already given the answer to my questions, but I'll double check if that's okay. I was also wondering about how much weight we should give to the anticipation of love argument or credibility. And I'm playing a bit devil's advocate, maybe. So I was wondering whether we can apply it in the context of IVF. So some people argue that IVF is only permissible if you either implant all embryos or donate them to couples who will then carry them to term. And so some people may object to that and say, no, because this way you will force me into carrying all the embryos, so you will force me into more pregnancies that I plan to have, because I can't stand the idea of other people looking after my babies, if that makes sense. But I just wonder whether some people say, well, that's a little bit far-fetched to sort of use this, to say that you have this anticipated love for an embryo in vitro. So is this like a gradual thing? It seems like
sorry, I'm not sure. Yeah. I might have lost something.
Maybe I'm not.
Let me try to repeat what you said, and you tell me if I got it. Because are you saying the following? So as in vitro fertilization actually works, what happens is, if you're having trouble conceiving, or if you're using donor eggs or donor sperm, in the lab, we unite sperm and eggs and make embryos, and we make more embryos than we're going to ultimately transfer into the woman's uterus to become babies, because that's just how it works, because not all the embryos work out. And so in fact, what happens when you do in vitro fertilization is hopefully you get some babies, but you end up with some frozen embryos. Okay, and now this is the part that I might have missed.
Yeah.
Some people like to rescue
Yeah,
those
exactly.
embryos and turn them into babies because they think that all human embryos have the full moral status of persons. There's the worry that if people are going to do that, the original parents of those embryos might say, well, no, then I want to do it because that's mine.
Exactly.
And so you'd be forcing them into
Yeah.
parenthood. What do I think about that argument? So let me talk about that. So I think that's right. So if some people said, we're going to rescue your embryos unless you rescue them first, that might well force people into parenthood, and that's a totally messed up thing to do. And it's not okay to rescue other people's embryos. So I think, that's what I think. That's like a terrible thing to do to people. I think that people do have a legitimate interest in whether their embryos are turned into people. And if they don't want them to be, you definitely should not do it.
Yeah. So I agree with you. I was just thinking that some people might say, well, at that stage, it's actually, maybe a bit irrational or it's not very credible that you have that anticipated love for your child, so we shouldn't give it too much weight. Yeah, I was...
Okay, great. So the question is, embryos just don't have a lot going on. They're not very interesting.
And you're not carrying them.
And they're not located in your body, they're just in a petri dish. So isn't it silly to say, oh, I anticipate loving this thing? I guess I don't think that's silly at all because we all understand that can be turned into a baby. And if it's turned into a baby, that's your genetic child. So I think it makes perfect sense. No, some people might not feel, oh, I would want to raise that baby or that would be my baby, but many people would feel it. Thanks.
Hey Liz, thank you. I had a question similar to Amir's, so I kind of want to go back to that, but maybe offer you an alternative thought and see what you think about it.
Great.
So I sort of hear three different variables for you. So one is this thing, love, which I think maybe there's a collective sense of wanting to understand more what work it's doing. And then there's a person's preference ordering, given their options. And then there's the question of how their options are restricted. And in particular, often when we talk about force, whether that restriction is something we think is just or not. And Amia was interested in the preference ordering, right? And whether you thought it had to not just be typical, but reasonable. And you said yes. But there are lots of situations where I might have a perfectly reasonable preference ordering, but we don't think that just because the world makes it the case that I can't get what I want, I've been forced to do anything, right? So I really like to go out to dinner and have sushi, and I really like to go out to dinner with my husband. My husband doesn't like sushi. Nobody thinks he's forcing me not to eat sushi in order to go out to dinner with him, because it's a perfectly reasonable restriction that he's giving me. I mean, he could have better taste in eating, but nonetheless, putting that to one side. Okay, so the reasonableness of preference ordering isn't sufficient to get you force. So I guess what I'm wondering is whether you're sort of tacitly relying on the thought that the restriction of options is unjust, right? That being a different question from whether the preference ordering is reasonable. So first of all, whether you think it's the idea of it being unjust is doing some work there. But second of all, if so, whether that's where love is supposed to make the difference, right? Because maybe you think it's unjust to force people to have an option like this. Look, either you break your heart or you become a mother. And that's a very different location for the forcing. In some sense, you might be able to just dispense with preference orderings. So that was the question, like, is that a picture you would endorse? If so, great. Tell me more about why that's the case, that love makes it unjust. But if not, like, where is the forcing coming in?
Okay, so Hannah's question is, I gave a story about how outlawing abortion forces girls and women into motherhood, And I said, what matters is that there's this preference ordering, first choice, abort and kill the fetus. But then if that's ruled out by the outlawing of abortion, among the remaining options, gestate and raise the baby or gestate and give the baby up, that there's a strong preference for raising the baby. And I said that's how, and that's because of love. So the ingredients of my picture are love, there's a preference, love gives rise to a preference ordering, and then an option is restricted and you're forced into the thing you prefer. That's what I said. So one thing Hannah said is, in general, just not getting my first choice doesn't mean I was forced. So we have lots of preferences, there's lots of things that we want, but we live in the real world and we're involved with other people and various strictures, and that's right. So one thing that I think is really important is, as you then went on to say, it's not just that I prefer to raise my baby than to give my baby up, but it's like horrifying to me to think of giving my baby up. So the fact that the third option is experienced as awful, that matters. Not just that it's dispreferred, but that it's awful. I do think that matters. You said, is it going to be an ingredient of the story that restricting the option is unjust? I don't think so. It's more like that's supposed to be the upshot of the story. But I do think it's really important to the story that it's awful to give up my baby, not just that I would rather not. Not just that like my favorite thing is raising my baby. Thanks.
Could you give the mic to Linda?
Thank you very much. I had a very general question about the possibility that the right to abortion is explained in part by the assumption that we don't have a duty to put ourselves in situations where we'll then acquire further duties. And I was wondering, in very general terms, how you distinguish between two different kinds of cases. So cases where we might acquire duties even though we had no duty to put ourselves in that situation where we would acquire those duties. And then cases where we don't acquire duties precisely because we didn't have a duty to put ourselves in that situation to begin with.
Can you just start from the beginning? Because I think you said something at the beginning that I didn't fully understand. Can you just say it again?
Yeah, so my assumption was that the right to abortion is explained in part by the assumption that we don't have a duty to put ourselves in certain situations where we'll then acquire further duties. So,
like being a parent?
Exactly.
Okay.
And then I was thinking, again, in very general terms, that we might distinguish between two different kinds of cases. So there might be cases where we acquire certain duties, even though we didn't have a duty before that to put ourselves in that situation where we'll acquire those duties. Right, so take the case where you run into a burning house in supererogatory fashion, but once you're inside, you have a duty to rescue someone when you could do that fairly easily. But there might also be cases where you could say precisely the opposite, namely that you don't have a duty to do particular things, precisely because you didn't have a duty to be in that situation to begin with. Sorry, this is very wordy, but you can see the kind of difference that I'm trying to get at.
Okay, thanks. So part of what you're asking is, when we think about why nobody should be forced into parenthood, is it an important part of the story that parenthood involves having some very weighty duties? So is that an important part of why we shouldn't be forced into parenthood? Sure, I guess. It's certainly true that parenthood involves some significant duties. Parenthood just involves a lot of different things. You know, it involves intimacy with another person and love, and as I said, there are many joys and sorrows of parenting, and like, parenting's awesome. I totally recommend it. But it's also complicated and heartbreaking, and and it varies how it turns out, and you don't get to know in advance how it's going to turn out. I don't think that like the heart of why you shouldn't force people into parenthood is that parenthood involves duties, because I just think that parenthood involves lots of different stuff, some of which is duties, and some of which is other stuff. Just like marriage involves duties, but it involves lots of other stuff too. But do you want to say more? I don't know if I really got to your whole question.
Do we have time, Roger, for a follow-up?
No, not really.
We can talk later, thank you.
Sounds good.
Sorry about that. Could you pass the mic to Becky?
Thanks. So I just wondered, this is a genuine question, I just wondered who you think this argument is going to convince. So you talked a bit about this judge, but sorry, I was aware this might sound really cheeky.
I like how you qualified it. I like how you were like, no, really, I'm really asking.
Yeah, well, because you talked about Barrett, and obviously this is in the context of the situation in the States, and it seems like the people there who are opposed to abortion are opposed for reasons like they think that an embryo is the equivalent to a 3-year-old child, and I just can't imagine that they will be like, oh, okay, love, yeah, we should let women have abortion.
Okay.
You know, so
Yes, I
I
understand
think
the
your
question.
argument is great, and but I agree with everything you've said, and I already think women should be able to have abortion. So, who are you gonna shift across the line?
Okay, great. So the question is, who do I hope to convince of anything that I've said? After all, most of us already thought there was a right to abortion, so I didn't convince you guys of anything. And then people who think there isn't a right to abortion typically think it's like because fetuses matter morally, and I just said, let's ignore that view. And so what are we doing here? Okay, so the answer is, I want to talk to all the people. So people who think that there's a right to abortion and who are sympathetic to the idea that maybe early fetuses have no moral status at all, or even just like a low level of moral status, I want to convince you that this is the right story of why we need a right to abortion. And part of why it matters what the story is the scenario where artificial gestation improves, because then we really need my kind of story. Both to prevent women from being forced into motherhood and to prevent them from being forced into pregnancy, we need a new story about how artificial gestation, about how the right to exit the fetus from your body doesn't even protect you from being forced into pregnancy if artificial gestation technology advances. But then I also want to talk to Barrett and other similarly misguided people and say, you're not understanding your opponent's right. So here's what your opponents should be thinking. And so that matters. So, and just in general in philosophy, if you make an argument that has substantive assumptions that not everybody agrees with, that's still an argument that should be interesting to everybody, ideally, because the people who disagree, they should care what their opponents are committed to and what their opponents' views should look like. Thanks.
So it's not quite 6, and we did start a bit late. So what I'd like to do is squeeze in the 2 final questions from Kate and Janet.
We'll be concise.
Maybe you could ask them together, and then
Kate and Janet.
Yep.
so Kate, you go
Okay.
first.
My question is actually about the artificial gestation part of your talk, because so you said, and you're going to talk about this in the next lecture, that early trimester abortions are fine, like there's no moral status there. But clearly the fetus gains moral status at some point along the gestational track.
Agreed.
And obviously, I actually think that even the early term ones have moral status, even if we don't want to say that they have rights or personhood or whatever. Like, they're still important entities, at least by the lights of their parents. I think that comes down partly to Katherine's question too.
Oh yeah, you should definitely come to lecture too.
Okay. But so the question is, like, so Judith Jarvis Thompson didn't actually think that we could kill the fetus after it's been aborted, unless if it didn't already die. And then Philippa Foot also has an interesting thing, like with the trolley problem. She says, so you said you can sacrifice the one person, but if they manage to leap off the track, well, you don't get to turn around and slit their throat, she says. And so I guess my question is, like, well, the big worry with artificial gestation is that once you've changed the location of this entity, now it actually has a completely different set of moral properties. And one of those moral properties might be some, I don't know, maybe not a full-blown right to life or something, but maybe something that we would more associate with, like, animals. We still don't think that it's
okay to just do whatever we want to it, and maybe it's not okay to just kill it. So I'm very curious to know more about what you think about why we would, if we could remove the fetus from the woman's body without killing it in the first place, why would we then not be permitted, or what would you say to people who then thought that it wasn't okay to kill it?
Great.
No, Becky has already asked.
Okay, cool. Okay, Kate's question is, doesn't it matter that in general, when we're, philosophers like to talk about these cases where we're in a perilous situation and it's okay to kill. So so Judith Jarvis Thompson gives us the violinist case where your kidneys are cycling the blood of a famous violinist, and your only way to just live a normal life is to kill him by detaching yourself. But if he somehow survived detaching, you couldn't then stab him with a knife. That would not be okay. Philippa Foote says, if you're allowed to turn the trolley onto the sidetrack, but the guy on the sidetrack somehow gets off the track, you're not allowed to go hunt him down. That seems right too. But so why would there be a right to kill the fetus if we have a way of exiting the fetus from the woman's body without killing the fetus? Why isn't it just the same? So I just agree that questions of moral status, as you were urging, really become important at that point, 100%. And so, and I did, it's on the handout that I said that. Thompson is going to get us nowhere. Like the Thompson violinist argument is going to be no help at all in justifying a right to kill the fetus. It's going to matter that the fetus doesn't have moral status. Absolutely. But I think it's like the embryos that we were talking about before. I think you get veto power over your genetic embryo or fetus getting turned into a person. You should have, because otherwise you're forced into parenthood. Is part of the story, but that's not even the whole story, I think. Thanks.